Imagine a life spent in limbo, where time has no idea what it's doing and neither do you. Most of us are just passing through, rushing from one place to another, maybe grabbing a snack, checking our phones, or silently judging that one guy in front of us who's taken way too long at the self-checkout. I mean, Jesus Christ, man, get a move on. A place where people normally spend an hour or two at most. They're only here for a little while before they move on to the next place because that's what this place is for. But for you, it's not a temporary stop. Days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months, and the people who work there actually start recognising you and calling you by your first name. They start bringing you breakfast, asking you if you want your usual. You didn't know that you had a usual, but now apparently you do. And while life around you goes on, you're just waiting. Waiting for something. But you're not sure what that something is, and soon enough, you just become comfortable with it. You've become part of this purgatory. That slightly too loud vending machine in the corner that won't accept crumpled up notes, that's you now. How did this happen? Why hasn't anyone noticed? And most important of all, how did you manage to get stuck in a place literally designed for people to be in for just like an hour before they move on to the next place? Everyone else gets to move on except you. Well, get comfortable at the airport lounge and don't worry about your ticket, you're definitely not going anywhere. This is the dimension of overpriced food stalls. It is an area that we like to call the Mad Lad Zone. This is the story of a man who had to live in an airport for 18 years. Mehran Karimi Nasiri. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. What is that scrumptious scent that tickles my nose and fills me with whimsy? Is it the hearty notes of a Christmas dinner? Perhaps it's the sharp and wintry breeze of the dark months hitting me with its crisp embrace. Nay, it's nothing of the sort. It is, of course, today's sponsor, Fume. Who are they? Are they a Christmas dinner? Well, I'm glad I made you ask. Fume is a gold standard air device with one objective: to help you break your bad habits by utilising flavoured air as opposed to gnarly chemicals and vapours, with no need for batteries and offering a veritable smorgasbord of funky, fun, fruity flavours for free-thinking fat fellows. Like me, of course. From raspberry lemon to crisp mint, Fume is sure to have a flavour for you. My personal favourite is peach blush, because not only does it taste yummy, but because it also reminds me of how I feel thinking about Fume and Santa. You see, I get warm fuzzy feelings when I think about Santa breaking into my house and denying me my presents to my face. I once got stuck in the I once got stuck in the chimney as a child because I tried to chase him up it. The next year he called me sad, fat, and unwell. I'm not sad. But do you know what is well? It's Fume's tactile and sturdy design with an intuitive airflow modulation system and inbuilt fidget capabilities housed in a sleek and chic chassis, which means I can reliably stim without worrying about my house-sized hiney crushing and deforming the poor thing. This has happened multiple times in the past, but never with Fume. So take that gauche and unwieldy old vape and do truly unspeakable things to it, because with Fume you don't need it. In order to get a hold of Fume for the festive season and break free of your bad habits, you need only scan the QR code on the screen or go to tryfume.com and use code Dankula for a free topper when you order a journey pack. Again, that is tryfume.com and code Dankula for a free topper when you order your journey pack. And now, back to the video. Miran was born in 1945 in Masjid Soliman, a small oil-rich town in southwestern Iran. His father, a respected Iranian doctor, worked for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a fact that gave Miran's family some social standing and relative comfort. But his mother's background was a bit more mysterious. According to Miran, she was actually Scottish, a nurse who his father had shagged while working with British expatriates. This unusual mix of cultures would later become a significant part of Miran's identity, or perhaps one of the reasons it was so difficult for him to define who he truly was. In his early years, Miran's life seemed fairly ordinary, at least by the standards of the time. He grew up in a relatively comfortable household and pursued an education, showing a particular interest in the Western scene. But family tensions brewed under the surface, and Miran claimed that his mother had actually left him and his father when he was young, although the details are foggy and this story is difficult to confirm. His life, even at this early stage, seemed shrouded in a kind of ambiguity, with inconsistencies that would only deepen as he grew older. So, moving forward, take everything that I say in this video with a pinch of salt, because the man, like a lot of our other mad lads, like to exaggerate at times and at other times just flat out lie. When Miran was in his late 20s in the early 1970s, he left Iran for the United Kingdom, where he enrolled in the University of Bradford. Because of course he did. But here, he allegedly pursued a degree in Yugoslav studies. That course was later renamed to Yugoslav history, but anyway, he was fascinated by the idea of studying different cultures and languages. Why Yugoslavia specifically, who fucking knows, but that entire career would have just ended with redundancy after a man got a little bit too horny in a field with some glassware. But anyway, with Europe as his academic playground, Miran saw himself as an emerging cosmopolitan citizen of the world. But despite the scholarly potential that he saw in this path, things that he had no control over would soon take him far off course. Change came to Iran as the decade came to a close. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution reshaped the country's political landscape by somehow making the place even worse. The Pahlavi monarchy, which was led by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was overthrown and replaced by an Islamic republic under Ayatollah Khomeini. It was a time of great upheaval, and the revolution affected Iranians from all walks of life, both inside and outside of the country. For those who had any ties to Western nations, or those who were suspected of opposing the new regime, life became a little bit complicated, but in most cases, dangerous. In the years following the revolution, Miran found himself caught between worlds. Whether he was directly involved in political activism or merely just in spirit is a matter of debate. But what is clear is that he, like many other people at the time, feared returning to Iran. He believed that he was in danger, whether from the new Iranian government or as a result of his associations with the West, because, well, I don't know if you're a history buff, but Iran doesn't like the West very much. So Miran wandered Europe seeking asylum, and he was granted refugee status by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Belgium in 1981. This status should have been his ticket to freedom. a chance to build a new life in Europe. But after obtaining refugee status, he started moving from country to country. It was as if he couldn't or wouldn't settle down. Over the next few years, he claimed that he searched for family ties in Scotland, he pursued residency in France, and he attempted to track down documents that would solidify his place in Europe. But the bureaucracy that he encountered proved challenging. Borders, passports, permits, and visas became very difficult things for him to obtain since they required documentation from a country that technically didn't exist anymore, because it just had a revolution and became a whole new country. At one point, he tried to establish himself in the United Kingdom, where he believed he had blood relations due to his supposed Scottish heritage. However, without the necessary documents to prove his family ties or nationality, he found himself turned away. With each country he entered, Moran seemed to collect more confusion than clarity. His papers were often incomplete, and his story, a mixture of facts and rumours and uncertainty, didn't really inspire the bureaucrats to bend the rules for him. His life was becoming a series of closed doors, and his story even harder to untangle with each passing year. This obviously isn't the case at all anymore. I mean, just turn up on a boat with literally zero documentation and we'll just put you up in a luxury hotel. Moran's struggle was marked by his persistence and, some might say, stubbornness. The help that was offered to him was often denied because of this stubbornness. And while you can say it was a noble pursuit of personal truth, you can argue that it was just another layer of complications in an already absurd story. As he navigated through European bureaucracy, his situation grew more convoluted. If you've ever spent hours filling out forms at the DMV, imagine spending years, maybe decades, trying to explain your identity to government officials with their famously low IQs, and then having to do just that across multiple countries. By the mid-1980s, Moran's attempts to secure residency were just hitting dead ends. With his legal documents either missing or disputed, he was in a constant state of uncertainty. It was an unstable situation for anyone to be in, and Moran was finding it more and more difficult to cope with the conditions that surrounded him. With increasing frustration, Moran seemed to just wander about, unsatisfied by everything around him. And so, on one fateful day, Moran found himself at Charles de Gaulle Airport. In August of 1988, Moran arrived at the airport in Paris. And this was just meant to be a short stop on his journey. With a handful of belongings, he settled down onto a bench in Terminal 1, intending to continue on his way to the United Kingdom, where he hoped to start a new chapter in his life. But soon he would find himself trapped in a situation that would see him spend nearly 2 decades living in this terminal. A fate riddled by missing documents, legal fuck-ups, government bureaucracy, and his own unwillingness to do much about it. When Moran landed, he was carrying a small, battered leather briefcase. A briefcase that he would later claim held the key to his future. Inside of it were documents proving his refugee status, granted by Belgium, which he believed would allow him to travel freely within Europe. But in a twist that he would later describe as a cruel joke of fate, Moran reported that his briefcase was stolen at a Paris train station, just shortly before he arrived at the airport. Some later suggested that he actually mailed the documents back to Belgium for whatever reason. Take that as a lie or the truth, but the fact was that he didn't have the documents that he needed to identify himself. Moran's life in the airport began due to a mistake, but it evolved into a surreal bureaucratic deadlock. Without any identification or proof of his refugee status, French authorities stopped him from flying out of the country, but also stopped him from leaving the airport back into France. Simply returning to Belgium or any other European country was also out of the question, because his lack of papers made it impossible for him to board a flight or cross a border legally. Basically, he was caught in a bureaucratic catch-22. He couldn't leave the airport out of the front door back into France, but he also couldn't leave the airport by plane to travel to another country. For all intents and purposes, he was stranded in a legal no man's land, confined within the boundaries of Charles de Gaulle Airport. At first, the situation seemed temporary, a matter that could be cleared up with just a few phone calls. This was obviously just a little bureaucratic oversight and would surely be resolved. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, with no resolution in sight. French officials, airport security and immigration authorities found themselves dealing with a man with nowhere else to go and no legal status that would allow them to kick him out. A customs official famously remarked, "He's not France's problem, he's not Belgium's problem, he's a man without a country." The irony of this situation wasn't lost on Moran himself when he said, "I didn't intend to stay here, but once you're here, you can't leave. And after a while you realise you're a part of this place, and it's a part of you." And so Moran stayed. I mean, it's not like he had much choice in the matter. Day by day, he began to create a kind of life for himself in Terminal 1. It was an unlikely home, to say the least. Terminal 1 was designed for transit, not residence. The chairs were metal, uncomfortable, and bolted to the floor, with little thought given to homeliness. Yet somehow, Moran adapted. He claimed a red plastic bench near a potted plant and 2 large windows. Over time, he accumulated an assortment of personal items like a suitcase, books, newspapers, and eventually even a small radio to pass the time. Moran quickly became accustomed to Terminal 1. He was just as much a part of the scenery as the baggage claim or the departure board. Each morning, he would make his way to the restrooms to freshen up, a small task that involved packing up his belongings and hauling them across the terminal. He would shave at the public sinks, he would brush his teeth, and he would change into clean clothes that he had acquired over the years. For breakfast, he would buy a coffee and a pastry from one of the airport's cafes with the small allowance that he received from travellers or airport staff who sympathised with him. And if you've ever been in an airport and bought anything, you know that that's quite a bit of pocket change. One airport staff member commented in a 1993 interview, "He's just here every day. It's like he's on a loop, living the same day over and over." But he never complains. He's polite, he's friendly, and he always says thank you. During the day, Moran would sit on his now famous bench, reading newspapers, sometimes spending hours carefully cutting out articles and organising them, or just writing in his diary. His knowledge of world events and current affairs was vast. Some travellers even started conversations with him to discuss politics or international issues, finding that he had many insights that one would come to expect from a well-travelled academic. Ironic, isn't it? As months accumulated into literal fucking years, people started to pay attention. Moran's predicament became a curiosity, attracting journalists and travellers in equal measure. Many asking him questions, and he was very happy to give them answers, albeit often bending the truth a little bit. Over time, his narrative shifted and grew more complex, adding to the mystery of who he really was and how he ended up in such a ridiculous story. Some visitors would ask him to recount his tale, and he obliged, describing himself as Sir Alfred Moran, adopting a kind of authoritative tone that made his existence in the terminal seem almost intentional, as though he were a judge, hammer in hand, holding court in his usual place. Despite the odd circumstances, the airport staff and security just got used to him. Many actually watched over him, offering him small gestures of kindness like a meal here and a newspaper there, with some of them even offering him blankets and pillows to make the night time a little bit easier. In a place where people were hopping in and out of it all the time, Moran became a familiar stationary figure, a kind of living landmark of the airport. When airport officials were asked why this random guy had been here for years now, most of them would just simply say, "Oh, that's Alfred. He's been here since forever." He found the familiarity of the airport calming. The artificial lighting, the background noise from the constant announcements, even the repetitive pop songs that you hear every single day did not jar him from the comfort of the environment. "I'm part of the airport now," he actually once said to someone, almost proud of the fact that he was stuck there. "Ah, you think the airport is your ally, but you merely adopted the airport. I was born in it, molded by it. I never saw an undelayed flight until I was already a man." However, his life in Terminal 1 was not devoid of drama. Over the years, Moran had health problems, likely linked to the stress and unpredictability of his situation. In 1999, he experienced a significant health scare where he fainted in the middle of the terminal as staff members rushed in to help. Paramedics were called and attended to him, but the treatment was not that extensive. When he was feeling better, he just got up and went back to his bench because he wasn't allowed to leave to go to the hospital. The reality was the paramedics couldn't really fix him that extensively or take him to the hospital due to his legal status. And so years passed, and Moran watched as the airport underwent renovations. He saw new shops and cafes open and close. He saw staff at the airport shops come and go, and he met countless people, airport employees, frequent flyers, and those who had just simply heard of the man in the airport, and they wanted to see him for themselves. Yet, his legal status remained unresolved. The paperwork issues that had stranded him there in the first place just became more and more confusing with each passing year. And as new officials came and went, few were willing or able to deal with his case. The questions only deepened. Who truly was this mustache-rocking man? What documents did he once have, and what happened to them? His story inspired everything from sympathy to skepticism. Some believed that Moran was just a victim of circumstance. Some believed he was actually a criminal who was on the run and was hiding his true identity, and others wondered if there was a lot more to his tale than he was letting on. But regardless of the doubts or theories surrounding this man, Moran's presence in Terminal 1 was the only true fact. In 2004, Moran's story reached a global audience with the release of The Terminal, a film loosely based on his life, directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Tom Hanks. And it is a pretty good movie. Although the film did fictionalise many aspects of his life and soften some of the harsher realities. It brought worldwide attention to the unique story of the Terminal Man, however. And for a man who has spent so much of his life alone, this newfound fame felt surreal. He was now the inspiration behind a Hollywood character, yet few people would fully understand the profound isolation and hardship that had been a part of his real story. A year before that, it was rumoured that DreamWorks had actually paid him $275,000 for the rights to his life story. But that was never confirmed by either party. But even for a man who had spent 18 years confined to Terminal 1 of Charles de Gaulle Airport, a day came when things would have to change. The years of living in the airport were taking their toll. It wasn't just the lack of routine healthcare that was wearing on him, but also the years of sleeping on an airport bench, surviving on just fast food, coffee, cigarettes, and the occasional puffs from his golden pipe. And also, most likely, the unadmitted stress from being isolated for such a long time. By 2006, something had to be done. Years of media attention and the support of lawyers and activists had highlighted his plight to the public. This new attention, combined with the fact that his situation had now gone on for close to 2 decades, finally spurred some action from the French authorities, and in standard government fashion, it only took them a little less than 20 years. After a group of officials, sympathetic supporters, and advocates worked to dig through the bureaucratic bullshit that had kept Moran in the airport, French authorities offered him a path to freedom. In 2006, the French government issued Moran with new legal papers and documents that would allow him to leave the airport for good. Government bureaucracy is so fucking ironclad and everyone is so terrified to bend the rules even just a little tiny bit, even in very special and unique cases like Moran's, that it took them nearly 20 fucking years for them to just go, fuck it, just give him documents. But leaving the airport wasn't as simple as it seemed. And this is the problem when you keep someone in the same building for a very, very long time. Moran had become completely institutionalized. He now didn't want to leave. In fact, the idea absolutely terrified him. He had developed a dependence on the routines and rhythms of the airport, and the prospects of re-entering a world that had passed him by just seemed too much. The world outside of the airport was now alien to him. One airport official even remarked, "He has been here for so long, it's become his home, his entire world." The airport staff had known him for years. They had seen him as a daily figure in the background of their own lives. To everybody else, he was just Sir Alfred. And in a way, Moran seemed to see himself not as a man trapped, but as a man rooted to a place. Despite his initial hesitation, medical concerns made it clear that he couldn't stay in Terminal 1 any longer. When he finally accepted help and left Charles de Gaulle, it marked the end of one of the most bizarre chapters in modern history. In July of 2006, with his newly issued papers in hand, Moran was escorted from Terminal 1 by French officials and was immediately taken to a hospital because he hadn't been to one in almost 20 years. For the next few years, Moran lived in a variety of settings. At first, he was moved to a hotel in Paris where he was monitored by social workers and health officials who ensured that he got all of the medical checkups that he had missed out on. For a man who had spent so many years in one location, the transition felt liberating but also unsettling. The outside world had changed a lot since he was last a part of it. Technology had advanced, social norms had evolved, the world had become entirely different. Moran, who was so accustomed to the artificial 24-hour cycle of airport life, found himself struggling to adapt. In his new life, Moran isolated himself. The normalised settings where he no longer had control over the details of his day-to-day life didn't fit him very well. The simple routines that defined a majority of his life, like gathering newspapers, watching people, chatting with travellers, etc., were now abruptly no longer a part of his life. It was reported that, at times, Moran spoke nostalgically about the airport, where he had been his own man, an eccentric figure in a passing world. He missed the familiarity of the place, the constant movement of it, and all of the small details that he got used to. In the end, after several years in transitional housing, Moran was granted the right to reside in a studio apartment in Paris, where he spent his days quietly. However, the prolonged periods of isolation had left their mark, and he struggled with physical and mental health issues. Having no remaining family or close friends, he became somewhat of a recluse. Still, for those who were made aware of him or who had once seen the man in the airport, he remained an object of curiosity and sympathy. But, as some would say, if you have a good thing going, You can't just let go of it. And so, in 2022, after more than a decade of trying to adapt, Moran gave up. And he made the choice to move back into the airport. Now, in his late 70s, he quietly settled into the airport once again, returning to the very same place that he had spent most of his adult life. The airport had changed, however, with different faces, different shops, different structures, and very few of the employees were able to recall the man who for quite some time had been a common sight in Terminal 1. But for those who did remember him, it must have been quite a surreal experience to see that motherfucker just come in, sit back at his usual bench, and carry on like nothing had happened, as though time had bent him back into an endless loop that he was stuck in so long ago. Moran returned to the only place that he had ever called home. His beloved red bench now had an owner again as he resumed his daily routines like nothing had happened, but this time with a lot less social interactions. It seemed that the time spent outside of the airport had been a mental drain on him, and he just wanted to be in a place where he could feel like himself again without the distractions of the fame that he had gathered. On November the 12th, 2022, not long after his return, Moran Karimi Nasiri passed away in the very same place that defined most of his life. At the age of 77, he suffered a heart attack while sitting on his famous red bench and took his last breath. For the people that got to know him, it was a bittersweet ending to a life of waiting and searching for a place to belong to. The airport staff that remembered him spoke very highly of his resilience to carve out a place that he could call his own, no matter how unusual that place was. Looking back at his life, one of the airport workers commented, "He was a part of the airport. It's hard to explain, but he made the terminal feel like it was his place." Moran's life became a story of identity both lost and found in the most unusual place. His presence became a tale that went far beyond the borders of the airport, inspiring people worldwide to reconsider their own belonging in the world and question what it means to have a home. It's a very sad story about a victim of government bureaucracy, but he was also a victim of his own little lies. The easiest and simplest thing to do would have just been to let him fucking leave. Government officials were informed from the get-go about his rather specific and unique situation, but when you come up against the immovable object of government bureaucracy that mostly only exists so that the government can't be held liable for things it would have to pay damages for, then that results in a man having to live in a fucking airport for 18 years. For Moran, the airport was more than just a terminal. In his own way, it was a microcosm of many worlds, a place where every culture passed through, and him being the only thing that remained consistent about it. And even though he never found the resolution that he was looking for, he at least found his own version of a home, a place that he could sit, wait, observe, and ultimately belong.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody just subscribe.